The small college town of Moscow, Idaho, nestled between rolling hills and dense pine, hadn't seen a murder in nearly 7 years. That changed in the early hours of November 13, 2022, when a brutal and senseless crime unfolded inside a house on King Road, just steps away from the University of Idaho campus. What should have been an ordinary Sunday morning for college students turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. By noon, four promising young lives had been cut short in a stabbing frenzy that would soon draw national attention and leave a community desperately searching for answers. The white, 3-story rental home had become a sanctuary for 6 female students during the fall semester. With its 6 bedrooms, 2 per floor, the house was often filled with laughter, parties, and the kind of youthful energy that defines college life. Madison Mogen and Zaina Kernadel lived there permanently. Kaylee Gonsalves, a former roommate, had recently moved out but was back for the weekend to visit her longtime best friend, Madison. Ethan Chapin, Zaina's boyfriend, had simply come to spend the night. That night, the house held 6 people, 4 would not survive to see the sun rise. Saturday, November 12, started like many others. Chapin and Kernadel were spotted at a Sigma Chi fraternity party just a few blocks away. The event wrapped up for them around 1:45 a.m., when the couple returned home. Mogen and Gonsalves had spent the evening at the Corner Club, a local bar popular among students. At around 1:30 a.m., they made their way to the Grub Truck, a mobile food vendor parked downtown. A Twitch livestream captured them chatting, appearing in high spirits, and ordering food. By 1:56 a.m., they had caught a ride from a private party, initially misreported as an Uber, and returned to the King Road residence. The house, at that point, was quiet. The 2 surviving roommates had reportedly been back since 1 a.m. According to early police reports, they slept on the ground floor and heard nothing during the massacre. However, later court documents revealed a different and far more chilling account. One of the surviving roommates, referred to in the affidavit as DM, had actually been on the 2nd floor, the same level as Kernadel and Chapin, when she heard noises during the night. At approximately 4 a.m., a DoorDash order was delivered to the home, intended for Kernadel. Not long after, DM said she heard someone upstairs say, "There's someone here." The voice, she believed, was Kaylee's. But phone records would later suggest Zaina was still active on TikTok at 4:12 a.m., casting uncertainty over who made the haunting remark. Then came the sound of crying. According to DM, she opened her door to investigate. What she heard next was a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Security camera audio from a nearby home would corroborate this timeline, capturing faint crying, a loud thud, and a dog barking around for 17 a.m. Moments later, DM opened her door again. What she saw next would change everything. A man, clad entirely in black and wearing a mask over his nose and mouth, walked silently past her. He had bushy eyebrows and an athletic build, and though she didn't recognize him, his image would burn itself into her memory. The man exited through the sliding glass door and vanished into the night. Paralyzed with fear, DM locked herself in her room. She didn't call 911. Hours passed. It wasn't until 11:58 a.m., over 7 hours after the murders, that a call was finally made to emergency services. The caller, using one of the surviving roommates' phones, reported an unconscious person inside the home. By the time officers arrived, the front door was ajar. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. And inside, a scene of unthinkable carnage awaited. The 4 victims had all been stabbed multiple times. There was no indication of restraint, no evidence they had been gagged. Blood had soaked into the walls and furniture. Mogen and Gonsalves were found together in Mogen's bed, on the 3rd floor. Kernadel and Chapin lay dead in Zaina's room on the 2nd floor. The pattern suggested the killer had moved methodically from one room to the next. Yet, somehow, 2 people had survived, and one had come within feet of the killer without being harmed. Adding to the strangeness, Gonsalves' dog was discovered unharmed on the 3rd floor. She had shared the pet with her ex-boyfriend, the same person she had tried to call several times between 2:26 and 2:52 a.m., along with Mogen. Police reviewed the call logs and ultimately ruled him out as a suspect. The unanswered calls were chilling but ultimately unconnected. Investigators were immediately struck by the calculated nature of the crime. The sheer brutality of the attack, coupled with the selective sparing of 2 roommates, led authorities to believe the killer had a specific target. But who was it? And why? The timeline was murky, but officials eventually pinned the window of the killings between 4 o'clock and 4:25 a.m. Forensics teams spent days combing through the house, collecting evidence. Meanwhile, the town reeled in shock. Candlelight vigils were held. Memorials sprung up across campus. Fear permeated every classroom and dormitory. Students left campus in droves, either too terrified to stay or simply overcome with grief. Behind closed doors, a massive investigation was underway. Over 20,000 tips flooded in. DNA was collected. Surveillance footage from neighboring streets was reviewed frame by frame. And slowly, a picture began to form, one that would lead police across the country in search of a suspect. Bryan Christopher Kohberger was a name that, at the time, meant nothing to the victims, their families, or the town of Moscow. But as investigators tightened their grip on the few leads they had, that name emerged from the shadows, attached to a 28-year-old doctoral student with an unsettling obsession. He was studying criminology at Washington State University, just 10 miles from the crime scene. Kohberger was intelligent, articulate, and eerily fascinated with the inner workings of criminals. He often engaged his professors in deep discussions about serial killers, control, and the psychological motives behind violent crime. One of his instructors later recalled how he dominated conversations, sometimes to the discomfort of others. His academic focus? The very kind of crime he was now suspected of committing. In the early weeks after the murders, Kohberger remained free. The public had no idea he even existed. But investigators did. The white Hyundai Elantra seen circling the neighborhood around the time of the murders was found registered to Kohberger. FBI agents had already started tracking him, following him across the country as he left Pullman and drove over 2,000 miles to his parents' house in Pennsylvania for the holidays. It wasn't just the car. Cell phone data revealed that Kohberger's phone had been near the King Road home on at least 12 occasions before the murders. Most of those visits occurred late at night or early in the morning. It was as if he had been studying them, learning their habits, silently watching from the dark. The most chilling fact? He turned his phone off for a critical window of time on the night of the murders, right before 2:47 a.m. and back on again at 4:48 a.m., just after the killings were believed to have occurred. But the DNA, that was the final thread that unraveled the case. Remember the leather knife sheath left behind in the bed next to Madison and Kaylee? The snap button bore a single male DNA profile. It didn't match anyone in the national database. So agents went further. They rummaged through the Kohberger family's trash in Pennsylvania. From that trash, they pulled DNA from his father and compared it to the sample on the sheath. It was a near-perfect match. Armed with this evidence, police moved in. On December 30, 2022, Kohberger was arrested at his family's home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. He was taken into custody without incident, his pale face captured in booking photos that would be seared into the nation's memory. The arrest sent shockwaves through both the Moscow and Pullman communities. Students who had once feared a nameless killer now struggled to reconcile the image of Kohberger, a quiet, awkward grad student who taught criminology classes and graded undergraduates on theories of crime. To many, he didn't look like a killer. But the evidence said otherwise. Court documents revealed even more disturbing details. Kohberger had allegedly returned to the crime scene just hours after the murders. Between 9:12 and 9:21 a.m., his phone pinged near the King Road house again. Was he checking to see if police had arrived? Did he want to admire his handiwork? The timing, coupled with the brutal efficiency of the murders, painted a picture of someone who wasn't just committing a crime, he was performing one. And the performance was deeply personal. Autopsy reports showed that the victims had been attacked with excessive force. Kaylee Gonsalves' injuries were notably more severe than the others, suggesting she may have been the primary target. Yet Kohberger, as far as anyone could tell, had no personal relationship with any of them. No mutual friends. No documented contact. No digital footprint linking them. Except for one thing. Investigators later found that an account believed to be Kohberger's had followed Kaylee and Madison on social media. And in the weeks before the murders, he had repeatedly messaged one of them. She never responded. With Kohberger now behind bars, prosecutors began preparing what would become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in the nation. Kohberger waived extradition and was flown back to Idaho, where he was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. In the courtroom, he stood silent. No emotion. No plea. Just the weight of 4 lives lost and the staggering mountain of evidence closing in. Still, questions lingered. What was his motive? Why these 4 students? Why that night? Some experts suggested Kohberger fit the profile of a burgeoning serial killer, someone who sought control, power, and recognition. Others pointed to his long history of social isolation, his battle with visual snow syndrome, and his obsession with understanding what made people kill. But even among those theories, nothing explained the brutality. The surviving roommates remained mostly silent, protected from the public eye. But one detail from the probable cause affidavit continued to haunt those who followed the case closely: the description of the masked man walking past a frozen roommate, saying nothing, and vanishing through the sliding door. Why did he leave her alive? Was it an oversight, or a message? As the legal proceedings unfolded, Kohberger's defense began to challenge the state's case, questioning the reliability of the DNA evidence, the traffic camera footage, and the cell phone pings. But the narrative was already deeply embedded in the public consciousness. A man with a fascination for murder had lived out his dark fantasy on an innocent group of students, then returned to his life as if nothing had happened. And yet, beneath the layers of evidence, speculation, and horror, something deeper stirred, a fear that this wasn't just a one-off tragedy. That somewhere in the stillness of that Moscow night, a ritual had begun. And rituals often have more than one chapter. Bryan Kohberger sat still, eyes glassy under courtroom lights, as the weight of 4 lives bore down on him through the voice of the judge. Gone were the sterile settings of university lecture halls. In their place was a courtroom steeped in dread, echoing with the pain of parents and the thunderous silence of 4 futures violently erased. This wasn't a quick open and shut case. The evidence had to breathe. The prosecution had to stitch together a timeline so airtight it would suffocate any shadow of doubt. And Kohberger's defense, led by public defender and Taylor, prepared for war, not just over facts, but over the very psychology of guilt. The prosecution unveiled a chilling timeline, pieced together through hours of surveillance footage, digital data, and behavioral evidence. Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra had been tracked zigzagging through Pullman and Moscow in the dead hours before the murders. His phone, silent during the killings, pinged into life just after 4:45 a.m., eerily close to the crime scene. DNA recovered from a Kabar knife sheath lying next to Madison Mogen's body? A familial match traced back to Kohberger's father via forensic genealogy. Statistically, the odds of it being anyone else were nearly non-existent. But still, Kohberger pled not guilty. And from that moment, the trial began to transform. It wasn't just a legal process anymore. It became a character study of a man who may have blended intellectual curiosity with something much darker, a taste for control. As the trial date loomed, investigators peeled back layers of his life. At Washington State University, where he pursued a Ph.D. in criminology, classmates recalled a man increasingly erratic in demeanor. In the months leading up to the murders, he had grown impatient, combative. He dominated discussions on serial killers, pressing for answers on how they chose victims, evaded capture, and manipulated crime scenes. He seemed less interested in justice, and more enthralled by the process of killing. That Reddit post surfaced again, casting a long shadow. Kohberger had posted it months prior under a research survey. How did you leave the scene of the crime? What were you thinking and feeling? Chilling in retrospect, the post no longer seemed academic, it read like a blueprint. But the trial also raised more unsettling questions. Was this the first time Kohberger had killed? There were no documented incidents. No violent arrests. Just a trail of subtle red flags, substance abuse, weight fluctuations, disturbing journal entries describing feeling numb, void, and like he was observing life from outside his own body. He had allegedly told acquaintances that he could read people's minds. To some, he came across as socially inept. To others, downright unsettling. In the courtroom, the state methodically laid out each victim's last moments. Kaylee Gonsalves and Madison Mogen were found in the same bed, their wounds extensive and targeted, suggesting they were killed first and possibly together. Zaina Kernadal, who was still awake around 4 a.m. due to a DoorDash delivery, bore defensive wounds. She had fought for her life. Ethan Chapin, sleeping in the same room, was ambushed. Then came the testimony from the surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, she recalled seeing a masked man, clad in black, walking calmly past her toward the exit after the murders. His eyes, she remembered, were fixed, blank, unhurried. He said nothing. She locked herself in her room in fear, unaware of the slaughter that had unfolded upstairs. The defense tried to sow doubt. The DNA on the sheath, they argued, was touch DNA, it could have been transferred. The cell phone records were circumstantial. And Dylan's delayed 911 call? It didn't align with someone fleeing in panic. But the evidence, though circumstantial, was deeply coordinated. Each data point was another nail in the proverbial coffin. A profile of Kohberger began to form, not as a spontaneous murderer, but a methodical predator. He had no known connection to the victims, yet digital forensics suggested he'd studied their movements. Investigators believe he'd visited the King Road house at least a dozen times in the months leading up to the attack, often late at night. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence came from Kohberger's phone. Weeks before the murders, he'd searched the property on Google Maps and took screenshots. After the murders? He cleaned his car with such thoroughness that police reported stripped floorboards and chemically treated upholstery. Then there were the gloves. When police raided his family's Pennsylvania home, Kohberger was seen wearing surgical gloves while placing trash into neighbors' bins, an attempt, they believe, to avoid leaving any traceable DNA behind. But it was too late. The trash they recovered from the Kohberger home was a match to the DNA on the sheath. The public sat gripped not only by the tragedy, but by the idea that a student of crime, an aspiring expert in how to solve murders, may have used that knowledge to commit one. Or four. As the trial wore on, families of the victims sat just feet from Kohberger. Every stare, every unspoken word, screamed of shattered lives. These were children, intelligent, kind, ambitious, ripped from the world in a calculated display of control. The prosecution did not seek the death penalty yet, but that decision loomed. Idaho is one of the few states with an active death penalty statute. And many in the community, especially the families, believed this crime warranted it. If anyone deserved to face death for what he had done, it was the man who had brought a combat-grade knife into a house full of sleeping students and left nothing but blood and silence behind. And Kohberger? He remained expressionless throughout, save for brief moments when forensic evidence was discussed, where his gaze sharpened, lips tightened, as if mentally calculating odds and probabilities. The world now waits for a jury to determine the next chapter. Until then, the faces of Kaylee, Madison, Zaina, and Ethan remain frozen in time, forever young, forever robbed. And Bryan Kohberger? He stands at the nexus of horror and justice, his name etched into the same history he once studied. But unlike the pages of his textbooks, this time, he is the subject. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more content like this.